Hey there, AP Hub team. In case you don't recognize my voice, this is Miss Sanchez. I didn't exactly add the flip lecture intro music because this is definitely a flip lecture that's just for your ears only. I will definitely be re-recording this. Again, I apologize, my voice is still not 100%, so I'll do the best I can. I'm going to try to keep this super brief, but I definitely wanted to hit some key points in regards to boundary making. We spent some time in class talking about looking at political geography, introducing concepts like state versus, again, nation. So, of course, if we're talking about an issue of a state is separated from its neighbors by boundaries or invisible lines that mark the extent of the state's territory and the control that its leaders have. We've looked at before in past flip lectures in your AMSCO packet, sometimes boundaries are set by physical features. So if we look at rivers or shores or mountains, other times they're drawn into separate ethnic groups from one another. Boundaries may have set by negotiation with war, and they're open to changes. So in this lecture, I wanted to hit again some concepts of boundary making. And in between, I'm also going to kind of interweave a discussion of boundary disputes. So if you can go ahead and take out the lecture packet that you received in class last week that you can see on the screens titled Boundary Making. Let's see if we can get this to get through this together with my limited voice. All right, so you can see on the screen right now, I have a slide that's typed up that says, again, basically the 4 steps to keep in mind if we're talking about creating official boundaries. Now, to create official boundaries between states, that's a difficult process. We have to keep in mind that states you could kind of look at from the perspective are evolving. They're almost like, organisms in themselves. They're living, they're breathing, they're changing. They come with their own backstory, their own history, their own culture. So you can imagine necessarily that trying to create boundaries between 2 states is a difficult process. It can take a long amount of time. You're talking about 2 different states in terms of their sovereignty or their power. And we also keep in mind that once boundaries have been negotiated, of course, that also requires the international community to be able to recognize how the boundaries are drawn so they can also interact with that space. So off to the side, and there is no slide, so hold your freak out moment. I just want you to write 4 words because in AMSCO, I believe you also read a little bit about boundary disputes. I want to make sure I just kind of interweave this vocabulary best I can, just in case there was an FRQ question on it. So talking about boundary making, we can obviously understand that that is a process and it can cause conflict. So for boundary disputes, just using the correct terminology, which we'll start explaining it and make more sense, we have definition, we have locational boundary disputes, allocation boundary disputes, and operational boundary disputes. All right, the first step in boundary making official boundaries is the definitional process. This one actually can be one of the most difficult process, the portion, excuse me, because this is when you actually have to sort of sit down at the table and necessarily describe where the boundary will fall, and it's something that has to be negotiated between the different states. So we've mentioned this before, one of the most famous examples when we go back to is the Berlin Conference. So reminder, we did kind of stress the really important historical background for the political unit is to understand the concept of imperialism. So when we go back in history, the Berlin Conference, which was roughly around the 1850s, or 1880s, excuse me, was the conference in which European powers carved up Africa. Talked about that the type of boundaries that were put in place were superimposed boundaries. But in essence, when Europeans sat down at the table, they were in that definitional boundary process. Another example that I wanted to show or kind of share right here, this one is again from the United States, more recent example. But originally, you can see there's a boundary dispute that's happening, an allocational dispute, in which the boundary originally, when it was defined, the original boundary in this map was actually the red line. The red line, actually, the way that was fall, it was difficult to put into place because we see that you have the water, you also have Appalachian Mountains. So when it was actually necessarily put into practice, this black line was actually the boundary between, again, what we see, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Georgia. Now the problem is today, now again, this sort of gray area in between, now you have an allocational boundary dispute because now that water, now that there's issues of water rights issues. So again, the first step is the difficult part, is to delimit it. But as we're going to see, again, there's several steps after that you have to put it into practice there. Another good example of a definitional boundary dispute that we could put into place is looking at the discussion or the boundary that we see between, in this case, Argentina and Chile. The boundary between Argentina and Chile has been controversial because originally the way it was agreed upon, it follows the crest of the Andes Mountains. And it's difficult because the Andes Mountains and the watershed and different resources that have been found, such as oil and natural gas, they don't not necessarily all coincide. So we see a case where now Chile and Argentina have been fighting of where we necessarily define that boundary to lie between the two countries. The second step in boundary making after you define the boundary is we talk about the delimitation process. That's where you actually limit or draw it on the map. So looking at, for example, we talked about one of the newest states that was created was South Sudan. So again, there was a negotiation process. They had to define that boundary, and then they actually have to delimit it on the map in that case. Here again, when we delimit or actually put on the map, we can also run into another dispute. So in this case, we can have a dispute which we refer to as a locational boundary dispute, right? If we put on the map, here's a great example, again, going back to the United States, in which the Mississippi River was originally, again, the boundary. But a river can shift over time, which we see case in point, the Mississippi River. So the question is, where does that boundary, how do we define that boundary now? How do we put it on the map? Do we go by where the Mississippi River is now? Or do we necessarily interpret it where the Mississippi River was when the agreement was still put in place? That can cause conflict if you're looking at a location, a territorial boundary dispute. Also, under the category of delimiting the boundary, we can have questions of resources. Now, I kind of mentioned in regards to the Chile-Argentina example, looking at that piece, but if we're looking at, natural resources, we also can interpret it in allocation boundary dispute. So looking at through the lens, in this case, we have resources, the boundary between, again, Kuwait and Iraq. Now, in that case, the boundary between Kuwait and Iraq, you have natural resources that are oil. So the question is, you've already delimited on the map or on that case, but how do the two states necessarily share those resources that are extracted underground? So that could be a situation. Now, if you're talking about ground resources, whether it's oil or natural gas, we also are going to be talking about in class, and that's why I put stay tuned for this one, how we have boundaries in the water, right? Some of you say, okay, it's easy to understand boundaries on land, but how do we divide up necessarily, the earth is covered by so much water, the Pacific Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, what will that situation look like? So we're going to use a concept the United Nations created, a treaty which was resolved, which is called the Law of the Sea. I don't want to go into that just yet, number one, because my voice, but number two, this one has also been very trendy on the FRQ prediction, so I really wanted to take some time to dive into the Law of the Sea. But the Law of the Sea will also be a great example of an allocation border or boundary dispute possibly. All right, the third in your flipped lecture is the third process is looking at demarcation. Demarcation, again, you actually mark it on the landscape. How do you necessarily designate where the border starts, where it begins? Do you build that big, beautiful wall? Do you put up a sign? Do you put up a flag? Interesting enough, we can see two examples on the screen of, again, how two countries, in that case, demarcate their boundary. So here at the top, I mentioned in class, this is an example in some parts where, again, the boundary between the United States and Canada, which is just a simply, looks like a stone, a little barrier, and then you see just a sort of white line drawn on the ground. Versus, again, here's another example of falling to the south, where it's the United States and Mexico border. So sometimes looking at how we demarcate the landscape can also indicate, the relationship between two places. Not necessarily between whether countries get along or not, but just, how their boundary, how do they view their boundary? Does one side view it as, okay, open borders? Does one necessarily want to close it off? Do they have that open border concept? So this one's just very interesting. Now, it sounds like a funny thing, but demarcating the boundary can also be a positive thing, right? You don't want to be just like wandering, in some open field and oops, I'm in North Korea now and I get captured by some, foreign government. So it's nice to know kind of where you're at, literally where you're at. So it's important that we do, sovereign states do demarcate their boundaries and borders. Just real quick, again, we looked at a video clip we played on Friday looking at how we demarcate the DMZ zone between North and South Korea, or the demarcation line in that case. So that would be another really good example to necessarily review and have that in your sort of example FRQ database. One example that I didn't get to play in class that I'm going to send out after this flip lecture is looking at another example of the Israeli bank barrier. So the FRQ attached with the flip lecture is talking about walls, borders, and barriers in that case. So if we use examples, for example, the Berlin Wall, looking at the Israeli West Bank barrier, looking at the North and South Korea DMZ zone. So like I said, I want you to watch the little video that I'm going to send after the flip lecture. It's only about 2 minutes, but it'll also give you a great example of, again, a country, how they demarcate the landscape with the use of a wall. All right, the last slide I want to hit just briefly in the boundary making process, it is administration. So the next step, of course, is how do we necessarily enforce, how do we protect the border? Do we necessarily have open borders? Now, when we start looking at next week, we're going to look at supranational organizations, looking at the United Nations, looking at an organization known as the European Union. For example, the European Union right now has open borders. You don't necessarily, we're very familiar for a lot of us that have crossed down to, Mexico, visit family, friends, or vacation and travel, the process of what it takes to come up through, again, the checkpoints, added security. So, example, when I was traveling for Europe, it was very easy necessarily just to travel through country to country. There wasn't necessarily this holdup. So, open borders is a concept that has, the wave of globalization and countries working together in Europe. Now, there's challenges with that. We have situations in which a few years ago we had the attacks in Paris, for example. The perpetrators of the attack were very easily able to cross through Belgium and different countries trying to elude the forces, right? Because it was very easy. There was no one stopping them, checking them, holding them up in that case. So there's definitely pros and cons to that situation. And that could kind of lend itself to that last example of a boundary dispute, which is looking at operational boundary disputes. So this can cause, two countries, how are we going to necessarily enforce and interpret, how do we put that into place of the boundary between our two countries? All right, I know this was a very quick run through and a very difficult lecture to understand. I did my best for today. Again, please do your best to make sure you go back through AMSCO and annotate some additional notes. There will be a very brief and short quiz tomorrow in class based on this, as well as the state morphology. So that was the one that I sent out yesterday, looking at the state shapes, looking at things like elongated, compact, landlocked. So what are some challenges and what are some some pros and cons of those different state shapes. All right, I'll give my voice one more day to rest, and then I'll see you guys back in class. Have a great weekend.